This week's Parsha, Parsha's Shemini, discusses the laws of kosher, the kosher animal, kosher fish, and kosher birds, and famously, the signs of a kosher animal are split hooves, and that the animal chews its cud, and the signs of a kosher fish are fins and scales. So today I'm going to learn a Mishna with you, and we're going to analyze it and find out it has very relevant life applications, both for ourselves and for educating our children and students. The Mishna in Masechtas Nida says like this: Kol sheyesh lo kaskeses yesh lo snapir. Any animal that has any fish, that has scales, for sure has fins. V'yesh sheyesh lo snapir v'ein lo kaskeses. But there are such fish that do have fins, but they don't have scales. Kol sheyesh lo karnayim yesh lo tlafayim. Any animal that has horns, for sure has split hooves, and you know it's kosher. And there are animals that do have split hooves, but they don't have horns. So again, the Mishnah over here is telling us that there are certain signs in the animal that as long as you see that sign, you know that the important kosher sign is there. For an animal, as long as I know it has horns, then I'm going to know it's going to have split hooves. And for the fish, which needs both the fin and the scales, if I see a fish that has fins, I don't necessarily know that it has scales. But if I see a fish that has scales, then I know for sure it has fins. The Gemara asks on this: if every fish that has scales automatically has fins, why does the Torah need to tell me that the fish needs to have fins and scales? It seems redundant. Every fish that has scales anyways has fins. Why does the Torah need to mention it explicitly? And the Gemara answers lahagdol Torah uladira, yagdol Torah v'yadir, to expound on Torah and to spell it out beautifully. So in other words, for Torah to actually, it's important for Torah to actually spell out both the fins and the scales, even though I could have learned one from the other, but to the point of expounding and actually making Torah clear and articulate. That's the Mishnah and that's the Gemara. We've spoken once before about the Rebbe's Rishimus, the Rebbe's personal notes that were found after Gimel Tammuz, where the Rebbe expounds on this and its life lessons according to Chassidus very beautifully. What's the difference between fins and scales? Scales represent a sort of armor to the fish to protect bad things from not coming in. So that represents, let's say, integrity or respect, the ability to hold by rules and hold by what's true and to not allow foreign energies, foreign influence to penetrate. For example, a school. A school that teaches its students not necessarily to be creative and expressive, but to remain and follow what's Torah true and to not allow outside influences to penetrate, to make sure students don't step out of line, or someone that is just naturally disciplined, does what he has to do and doesn't allow damaging things into his life. That's what scales represent. Fins represent someone that is creative and ambitious. The fins are the stuff that the fish moves through water. This represents someone that's looking to, has big ambitions in life, is creative, is able to develop ideas, doesn't like feeling restrained, but likes utilizing his talents and letting himself soar as far as he can. Now, obviously, these are both noble traits, but where do you start? You're building a school, you're building a family. What's the beginning and foundation? So comes the Mishna and tells us, an animal or a fish that has fins doesn't necessarily have scales. We don't start with letting everyone just express their creativity and passions. That could go out of whack. Someone that's just self-expressive and that's working and successful for the sake of feeding their ego, when they haven't yet learned to put their ego in check and to be subservient to God, then even their fins could get out of whack. You don't start with fins. What you need to start with is scales. Start with scales to make sure that I know life's not about me. Life's not about me fulfilling my every desire and craving. I have discipline. I have integrity. I'm a man of truth. And any fish that has scales will eventually develop fins. Not all fins will develop scales. But scales will automatically, if someone is a man of God that's looking to do what is right, at some point he's going to realize that what's right is that God wants him to utilize his talents as well. So scales is important to start with, not fins. However, the Torah does find it important to mention fins also, because of Yagdol Torah v'Yadir. Don't think that means that the Torah just wants us to remain God-fearing people that don't allow damaging influences into our life. Torah wants Yagdol Torah v'Yadir. Torah wants Torah to be expounded and beautified. Torah wants us to be ambitious, wants us to utilize our talents and expressions and to flex those for the sake of God and sanctifying his name as far as they can. but for the sake of God and for sanctifying His name, not for the sake of projecting our egos. For that, once I have scales, then the Torah says, I want to tell you fins also. I want to show you this concept of beautifying Torah, and I want you to do that yourself. If you have a brain, use it. If you have a singing voice, use it. If you have talents in business and fundraising and building up an organization, go do it. But start with scales and let those scales eventually bring you towards the fins. That's point 1 of the Mishnah. Point 2 of the Mishnah is somewhat similar, and it represents what do we say over there is how every animal that has horns for sure has hooves. Any animal that has hooves doesn't necessarily have horns. What's the difference between the horns and the hooves? The hooves represent remaining above the lowness of this world, right? The animal's foot is planted on the ground, the dirt, and the hoof leaves it a step above the ground. This represents not falling too low into the dirt of the world. The horns represent beauty and strength that is above the head, above where the head naturally reaches. Like the Torah refers to Keren Mashichai, the horn of anointed mint. In other words, glory, grandeur, and rulership, malchus, which is above where the head naturally reaches, a exalted connection to God. And comes the Mishnah and says, just because someone is removed from the world, someone has a hoof, doesn't necessarily mean that they have horns. Someone could be, I'll say the other way around and then we'll explain it. Someone that does have horns, though, for sure shows that they're going to have a hoof. An example for this would be, there's a concept of someone who's not a liar, but he's not necessarily a man of truth. Right? That would represent someone that has a hoof. I'm not a liar, I'm not dirty, I'm removed from the dirt. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a man that is truthful and brings authenticity into my life and to the people around me. But someone that is a man of truth, someone that has a positive, exalted connection to God, for sure will have a hoof, for sure will be separated from lying. Most positive attributes, Judaism doesn't want us to develop negative attributes, even negative attributes away from negative things. Torah doesn't want us to not be dishonest. It wants us to be truthful. Torah doesn't want us to not be depressed. It wants us to be happy. Torah doesn't want us to not be petty. It wants us to be grand. Mamlachas Kayanim v'Goy Kadosh. So instead of focusing on trying to remove ourselves from bad habits, what we should try to do is to try to positively engage the good habits. Because someone that's going to have the horns will automatically remain removed from the ground, versus someone that's trying to remove themselves from the ground. And every habit doesn't necessarily reach that center of the target, the ultimate positive trait under discussion. So what we have over here is two concepts. On the one hand, when in our own lives, what we have to start with is, first of all, developing Yiras Shamayim, developing fear of heaven, to do what we have to do and to make sure negative influences don't affect us, to make sure we're not just here to project our egos, but to make sure we have scales, to make sure that we have proper walls, and we are committed to the structure set on us by God. And within that, we're going to be able to flex our muscles and be successfully ambitious. From the scales, we're going to get to the fins. And the lessons from the animal is, instead of trying to just focus on Sur Meira to get to Asay Toiv, instead of first trying to remove ourselves from bad habits. Don't say, I could only get involved in Judaism, I could only get involved in spirituality when I first remove myself from all my negative vices. Get involved in Judaism, get involved in spirituality, and in a relationship with Hashem, and automatically, once you develop those horns, you're going to develop the hoof, what separates you from the ground will come automatically. Have a great Shabbos.